The radio crackled with static before the voice cut through like a blade through silence. Overlord, this is Bravo 6. Mission is compromised. We are weapons dry and taking heavy contact. Request immediate extraction. The words hung in the command center's stale air like smoke from a funeral pyre. 23 Navy SEALs, the elite of the elite, pinned down in a narrow valley 40 clicks from the Afghan-Pakistan border. Their target, a high-value Taliban commander moving a weapons cache, had turned into a death trap. Colonel Marcus Holloway stared at the tactical display, watching red dots converge on his men's position like antibodies attacking an infection. The blue dots representing his team had stopped moving entirely. That wasn't good. When SEALs stopped moving, it meant they were either dead or about to be. "Sir," the communications officer's voice trembled slightly. "They're requesting immediate close air support. Enemy strength estimated at over 200 combatants with heavy weapons." Holloway's weathered fingers drummed against the metal table. The nearest Apache gunships were 40 minutes out. The AC-130 Spectre was grounded for maintenance. Every F-16 in theater was either refueling or committed to other operations. In the mathematical brutality of modern warfare, 23 American lives were about to become acceptable losses. The colonel opened his mouth to give the order to withdraw when a different voice cut through the chaos. "Overlord, this is Phantom 77 requesting permission to provide immediate close air support." The voice was calm, professional, and unmistakably female. Holloway's eyes swept the flight board. Phantom 77 wasn't even supposed to be in theater. According to his records, that aircraft was conducting routine reconnaissance over the relatively quiet Helmand province, nearly 200 miles away. "Phantom 77, you are not authorized for combat operations," Holloway replied, his voice carrying the weight of regulations and bitter experience. "RTB immediately. Return to base." Standard protocol. By-the-book thinking that had kept him alive through 3 tours but had also cost him sleep on too many nights to count. "Negative, Overlord. I have eyes on the convoy. Multiple technicals with mounted weapon systems approaching Bravo 6's position. They're about to be overrun." The pilot's voice remained steady, but there was something else there, a quiet determination that made Holloway pause. He glanced at his intelligence officer, who was frantically pulling up the pilot's service record on his computer screen. The man's face went pale as he read. "Sir," the intelligence officer whispered, "you need to see this." Captain Lyra Ghost Blackthorne had been flying combat missions when most of the SEALs currently pinned down in that valley were still in high school. Her service record read like a fever dream of impossible missions and classified operations. 3 Silver Stars, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and a call sign earned not from bravado, but from her uncanny ability to appear exactly where the enemy least expected her. The problem was, she wasn't supposed to be there at all. The F-15E Strike Eagle she piloted had been officially grounded pending an investigation into what the brass called irregularities in mission reporting. Translation: Ghost had been conducting unauthorized combat operations for the past 6 months, hunting high-value targets with the methodical precision of a surgeon and the ruthless efficiency of an executioner. Command couldn't prove she was operating outside her orders, but they couldn't ignore the body count either. "Phantom 77, state your ordnance," Holloway found himself saying, protocol warring with pragmatism in his voice. He knew he should order her back to base. He knew he should follow procedure. But he also knew that 23 good men were about to die if someone didn't act fast, and sometimes the right choice was the wrong choice according to the manual. 2 AIM-120 AMRAAMs, 4 AIM-9 Sidewinders, and a full load of 20mm, Ghost replied. Plus 2,000-pound JDAMs and 4 500-pound laser-guided bombs. I'm locked and loaded, Overlord. Just give me the word. The command center fell silent except for the steady hum of electronics and the distant sound of generators. Every eye was on Holloway, waiting for a decision that could save lives or end careers. The colonel closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of the young men trapped in that valley, thinking of their families back home who would receive folded flags if he made the wrong choice. Bravo 6, this is Overlord. Holloway's voice carried across the radio waves to the valley where death was measuring distance in yards instead of miles. You have close air support inbound. Call sign Phantom 77. Danger close authorized. The response from the valley was immediate. Roger, Overlord. We'll take all the help we can get. The SEAL team leader's voice carried relief and desperation in equal measure. They were running low on ammunition, and the enemy was closing in from 3 sides. In the lexicon of military disasters, they were what tacticians euphemistically called in extremis. Ghost's F-15E screamed through the Afghan sky at just under the speed of sound, her twin engines leaving contrails against the crystal blue morning. She had been monitoring the situation for the past 20 minutes, watching the thermal signatures through her targeting pod as the enemy forces moved into position. The Taliban commander had chosen his ground well, a narrow valley with steep sides that funneled any rescue attempt into a kill zone. It was a trap that had worked against Soviet forces 30 years earlier, and it was about to work again. But Ghost had spent the last 15 years studying asymmetric warfare, learning to think like her enemies, understanding their tactics better than they understood them themselves. She had seen this play before, in Iraq, in Syria, in half a dozen classified operations that would never make it into the history books. The enemy's strength, their superior numbers and position, was also their weakness. They were concentrated, predictable, and about to learn why American pilots had owned the skis for over 70 years. The captain rolled her aircraft into a steep dive, the G-forces pressing her into her ejection seat as she lined up for her first pass. Through her heads-up display, she could see the muzzle flashes from the enemy positions, could see the blue smoke from the SEAL's position markers, could calculate angles and distances with the cold precision of a mathematician solving an equation written in blood. Bravo 6, Phantom 77. I have visual on your position, marking targets with laser. Stay low and stay put. Her voice remained calm, professional, but her heart rate had kicked into combat mode. This was what she had trained for, what she lived for, the moment when skill, preparation, and pure will converged into something that looked like magic, but was really just warfare refined to its purest essence. The first bomb fell like a hammer of God, 2,000 pounds of high explosive guided by invisible beams of light to land exactly where physics and death had an appointment. The explosion lit up the valley floor, and Ghost could see secondary explosions as ammunition caches detonated. The enemy's disciplined advance became chaos in the span of heartbeats, their formations scattered like leaves in a hurricane. But Ghost wasn't finished. She pulled out of her dive and came around for another pass, this time lower, faster, more personal. Her 20mm cannon spoke with mechanical precision, each round finding its target with the inevitability of gravity. Vehicles exploded, weapons positions disappeared, and the tide of battle shifted in the space between one breath and the next. What had been a massacre in progress became a rout, and the hunters became the hunted in the eternal dance of predator and prey. Phantom 77, Bravo 6, the SEAL team leader's voice carried across the radio with something that might have been awe. That was some of the finest flying I've ever seen. The bad guys are in full retreat. We're consolidating position and preparing for extraction. Ghost banked her aircraft into a wide circle above the valley, her engines a constant thunder in the thin mountain air. She could see the enemy vehicles fleeing in all directions, their organized advance turned into a panicked withdrawal. It was a sight that never got old, the moment when superior firepower and superior tactics met inferior planning and produced the inevitable result. But she wasn't done yet. The intelligence reports had indicated that the Taliban commander was traveling in a modified pickup truck with distinctive markings. Ghost's targeting pod picked up the vehicle 2 miles from the valley, racing along a dirt road toward the Pakistani border. She could have let it go, could have been satisfied with saving the SEALs and calling it a mission accomplished. But Ghost didn't think in terms of mission accomplished. She thought in terms of mission complete, and the mission wasn't complete while high-value targets were still breathing. Overlord, Phantom 77. I have visual on a fleeing vehicle matching the description of our primary target. Request permission to engage. Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had made similar requests dozens of times before, someone who knew the difference between asking for permission and asking for forgiveness. There was a long pause from the command center. Colonel Holloway was probably consulting his legal advisors, his intelligence officers, his political liaison. He was probably thinking about rules of engagement, international borders, and the diplomatic consequences of American ordnance landing in Pakistani territory. He was probably doing all the things that good officers did when faced with decisions that had no perfect answers. Phantom 77, you are cleared to engage. Holloway's voice finally came back, and Ghost could hear the weight of command in every syllable. But make it clean and make it fast. The JDAM fell from the aircraft's weapon bay with mechanical precision, its guidance fins adjusting constantly as it fell toward its target. The Taliban commander's truck disappeared in a ball of flame and debris, along with any intelligence it might have carried and any future operations it might have enabled. It was clean, it was fast, and it was final in the way that only high explosives could be. Ghost pulled her aircraft into a climb, heading back toward friendly airspace with the satisfaction of a job well done. The SEALs were safe, the enemy was scattered, and the high-value target was high-value debris. It was the kind of mission that made the months of training, the years of preparation, and the personal sacrifices worthwhile. It was the kind of mission that reminded her why she wore the uniform. But as she leveled off at 30,000 feet, Ghost knew that her unauthorized intervention would have consequences. She had saved American lives, eliminated enemy combatants, and completed the mission objectives, but she had also violated direct orders and operated outside her authorized parameters. In the military justice system, results didn't always justify methods, and success didn't always prevent punishment. The radio crackled to life with a familiar voice. Phantom 77, this is Overlord. You are directed to return to base immediately for debriefing. Colonel Holloway's tone was neutral, professional, and ominous in its careful lack of emotion. Ghost had heard that tone before, usually right before lengthy conversations with officers who wore eagles and stars instead of bars and oak leaves. Roger, Overlord. Phantom 77 returning to base, she replied, her voice carrying none of the satisfaction she felt. In the military, victories were temporary but consequences were permanent, and she had just bought herself a front-row seat to a disciplinary hearing that would determine the rest of her career. As her F-15E streaked through the Afghan sky toward an uncertain future, Captain Lyra Blackthorne thought about the 23 SEALs who would be going home to their families, because she had chosen action over orders. She thought about the Taliban commander who would never plan another ambush, never coordinate another weapons shipment, never send another young fighter to die for a cause that measured success in body counts rather than human dignity. The sky was crystal blue above the mountains, unmarked by clouds or contrails except for the thin white line her own engines had drawn across the heavens. It was a beautiful day for flying, a beautiful day for fighting, and a beautiful day for making the kind of choices that would either make her a legend or end her career. Ghost smiled grimly behind her oxygen mask and pushed the throttles forward. She had never been one to do things halfway. Back in the valley, the SEALs were loading their wounded onto extraction helicopters. Their mission parameters changed from rescue to recovery, from desperate survival to triumphant extraction. They didn't know the name of the pilot who had saved their lives, didn't know her call sign or her service record. All they knew was that when death had seemed inevitable, salvation had arrived on twin pillars of fire and thunder, and 23 American warriors would be going home, because one pilot had chosen to be in the right place at the right time with the right weapons and the will to use them. The legend of Ghost was about to become more than just whispered stories in ready rooms and classified after-action reports. It was about to become the kind of tale that gets told and retold until fact and fiction blur together, until reality becomes mythology and individual acts of courage become eternal symbols of what it means to serve with honor. But legends have a price, and Ghost was about to learn exactly what that price would be. The command center fell silent as Ghost's aircraft disappeared from the radar screens, heading back to base and an uncertain future. Colonel Holloway stared at the tactical display for a long moment, thinking about decisions made in the heat of combat, about the difference between following orders and doing what's right, about the kind of officers who earn their legends by writing checks with their careers that their courage has to cash. "Sir," his communications officer said quietly, "the Pentagon is requesting a full report on the incident. They want to know how an unauthorized pilot managed to provide close air support to a classified operation." The young officer's voice carried the carefully neutral tone of someone who was smart enough to recognize when his superiors were walking through a minefield of regulations, politics, and military justice. Holloway nodded slowly, his weathered face showing no emotion. He had been in the military long enough to know that sometimes the right decision was the wrong decision according to the manual, and sometimes saving lives meant sacrificing careers. He also knew that Captain Lyra Blackthorne had just given him one hell of a report to write, and that report would determine whether she faced a court-martial or a medal ceremony. The colonel sat down at his desk and pulled out a fresh incident report form. At the top, in the section marked Classification Level, he wrote a single word that would determine how this story was remembered: classified. Some legends, he thought, were too dangerous for public consumption. But some legends were also too important to ignore, and Ghost's legend was just beginning to unfold across the classified corridors of American military power. In her cockpit, 30,000 feet above the Hindu Kush Mountains, Captain Lyra Ghost Blackthorne flew toward an uncertain future with the steady confidence of someone who had long ago learned to measure success not in medals or commendations, but in the lives saved and missions completed. She had been flying combat missions for 15 years, had seen friends die and enemies defeated, had learned that warfare was both the most noble and most terrible thing that human beings could do to each other. But she had never faced a situation quite like this one, had never been forced to choose so clearly between following orders and saving lives. The choice had been easy to make but would be difficult to defend, and she knew that her next conversation with her commanding officer would determine whether she continued to serve or found herself looking for civilian employment with a skill set that didn't translate well to corporate America. The radio crackled with routine air traffic control chatter, pilots checking in and out of controlled airspace, weather updates, navigation adjustments, the constant stream of communication that kept military aviation running smoothly. Ghost listened with half her attention, the other half focused on the horizon ahead and the reckoning waiting for her on the ground. She had always known that her career would end someday, had always known that the military justice system didn't make exceptions for good intentions or successful outcomes. But she had also always known that some things were more important than careers, more important than regulations, more important than the careful political calculations that kept the military bureaucracy functioning. 23 American warriors were alive because she had been willing to risk everything to be in the right place at the right time with the right weapons. That would have to be enough, regardless of what happened next. As her F-15E descended through the crystal Afghan air toward a future written in classified ink and sealed with official stamps, Ghost thought about the moment that had defined her career, the moment when she had chosen action over orders and lives over regulations. It had been, she reflected, a pretty good day for making history, even if that history would be locked away in classified files that future generations might never read. But legends, she knew, had a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to bury them, and Ghost's legend was just beginning to take flight. The base came into view on the horizon, a collection of concrete and steel buildings surrounded by razor wire and guarded by men who understood that freedom wasn't free and security wasn't guaranteed. Ghost lined up for her approach, her engines throttling back as she prepared to land and face whatever consequences awaited her on the ground. She had saved 23 lives that morning, had eliminated a high-value target, and had reminded everyone listening on the radio why American pilots were the best in the world. It had been, she thought as her landing gear touched down on the runway, a very good day to fly. Whether it had been a good day for her career remained to be seen, but some things were more important than careers. Some things were worth risking everything for, and Ghost had never been one to calculate odds when lives were on the line. As her aircraft rolled to a stop on the tarmac, she could see the staff car waiting for her, could see the officers standing in the shade of the operations building, could feel the weight of their attention like a physical force. The legend of Ghost was about to face its first real test, and the results would determine whether she became a cautionary tale about following orders or an inspiration about doing what's right when the two conflicted. Captain Lyra Ghost Blackthorne shut down her engines, completed her post-flight checklist, and prepared to face whatever music the military justice system had composed for unauthorized heroes who saved lives by breaking rules. She had no regrets about her choices that morning, and she would face the consequences with the same steady courage that had carried her through 15 years of combat missions in some of the most dangerous skis in the world. The legend of Ghost was about to enter its next chapter, and that chapter would be written in the quiet rooms where military careers were made and broken, where honor was weighed against regulations, where the difference between heroism and insubordination was measured in lives saved and rules broken. It was going to be an interesting conversation, and Ghost had never been one to back down from interesting conversations. As she climbed down from her aircraft, the Afghan sun warm on her flight suit and the smell of jet fuel sharp in her nostrils, Captain Lyra Blackthorne walked toward her commanding officers with her head high and her conscience clear. She had done her job, had served her country, and had saved American lives when it mattered most. Whatever happened next, she could live with the consequences of her choices. After all, legends were built on moments like these, on decisions made in the heat of combat when there was no time for careful deliberation and no margin for error. Ghost had made her choice, had written her chapter in the long story of American military aviation, and had reminded everyone that sometimes the most important victories were won by pilots who were willing to risk everything to be exactly where they needed to be when lives hung in the balance. The staff car engine was running, and her commanding officers were waiting. It was time to face the music, time to discover whether saving lives was more important than following orders in the complex calculus of military justice. Ghost walked toward her future with the confident stride of someone who had never learned to second-guess herself, someone who had spent 15 years proving that the impossible was just another word for difficult. The legend of Ghost was about to face its greatest test, and the results would determine whether she continued to serve or found herself looking back on a career that had ended not with retirement ceremonies and gold watches, but with disciplinary hearings and official reprimands. It was, she thought as she approached the waiting officers, going to be an interesting afternoon. But then again, Ghost had always preferred interesting to boring, had always chosen action over safety, had always believed that some things were worth risking everything for. Today had been one of those days, and she was ready to face whatever consequences her choices had earned. The legend of Ghost was far from over, and the next chapter was about to begin.